Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. I'm your host, Clint Davis. I'm a marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor trained in trauma and addiction. The Asking Why podcast is for anyone on a journey of healing and restoration. If you are searching for answers to life's questions and want to learn more about root causes from a psychological and theological mix, this show is for you. In this podcast, myself and a co-host from Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness will interview guests on a wide range of topics in order to get down to the heart of the problems facing our world and understand why things happen and how to change the world and ourselves for the better. Want to learn more tips and tricks to living a healthy lifestyle? Visit us at Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to meet our staff or book a speaker, go to clintdaviscounseling.com. Thanks for listening and be sure to subscribe today. All right, welcome to the Asking Why podcast, episode number 37. We've got Miss Olivia Mason and Mr. Brent Woods with us today, and we're going to be talking about sex addiction, love addiction, and all things in that realm. So there's some awesome therapists that Olivia works for me over in Ruston, and she worked for
Pine Grove, the Gratitude Program.
That's right. And if you've listened to her before on the podcast, she talked about family systems theory, and she did a great job with that and got a lot of great feedback from people about how awesome that was. So we had her back to talk about sex addiction. And then Brent Woods, you work for?
Woods Counseling in Lake Charles.
That's right. And so the goal of today is, we've done a lot about sexual abuse, sexual neglect. We've done a bunch of podcasts helping us talk about how to parent kids and how to, protect our children and all that stuff. And we did one on just addiction in general. But about halfway through that podcast, we were going to kind of cover sex addiction. I realized oh man, we need a whole 2 hours to kind of dive into this and talk about it. And so Brent and I worked together for the Children's Home for many moons ago. We were talking about that before. And right. So shout out to the Methodist Children's Home. And we got our CSATs, and then we both launched our own practices. And so I just thought it'd be awesome to have him come up to catch up and be a good resource, and Olivia to come back and talk about stuff because she's awesome. We have, just for people to know, we have, I think, 7 or 8 CSATs on staff, and then we have Andy Bond also, who's a PSAP, so he's a pastoral sex addiction therapist. So let's get into it. So Olivia, we'll start with you ladies first. Tell us kind of who you are and how you became a CSAT and why.
Yeah. Like Clint said, I'm Olivia Mason, so licensed marriage and family therapist, certified sex addiction therapist, and I'm also recently just became a brain spotting practitioner, which is really fun. So it's kind of like EMDR, just a little different, like a little tree branch off of that. So how I became a CSAT?
Yeah, tell your story a little bit. I know you talked about it the last time. But yeah, tell a little bit about why you became a therapist, and then just why CSAT particularly.
Okay. So I became a therapist. Really, I think all of it is just very much the Lord guiding me here. Never would have thought I would have ended up here. Actually had lunch a couple Sundays ago with some friends from college, and one of them was an old roommate. One of them has just been a really good friend, and they actually got married. But I was saying to them, would y'all have ever expected me to be doing what I'm doing? And they cackled.
Right.
They were absolutely not. And so, I guess my path to becoming a therapist was undergrad, was a kinesiology major, then a psychology major, changed over, found myself more interested in the mental health side of things and just why people were doing what they were doing. Had applied to LPC programs, didn't get in anywhere. And then again, it was just kind of the Lord guiding me. Ended up in Austin, Texas for a year working for an autism clinic. So kids with that was applied behavioral analysis work there. Realized I really did not like that work. I thought I'd be interested in it. Mm-hmm. Loved the kids, didn't love the work that was being done with them. It just wasn't up my alley. And realized I started asking more questions about who was helping the families, because they dropped these kids off for 3 to 6 hours of work, and then the parents and siblings would just leave. And so, I got to thinking, who's helping them? And that's what brought me to marriage and family therapy, was, some of that thinking in that path. Thinking I was going to work with special needs kids and their family. And then with the program that I did at University of Southern Mississippi, down in Hattiesburg, fantastic, marriage and family therapy program. I would recommend it if anyone's looking into it. They offered internships as a part of our graduate work there. And again, I mean, it's all just the Lord's work, because my first year there, I found out that there was the option to intern at the Gratitude program with Pine Grove, which is actually, I believe, the original program that Dr. Patrick Carnes started, or one of the original inpatient programs that he started. So he was the pioneer down there, got things going. I ended up getting an internship there during my graduate work. And I remember the first day I went, well, let me back up. Whenever they told me I was going to interview there, my program that I was in, I went and talked to our director, and I was like, I think y'all have the wrong person. Are y'all sure? And she was like, just go interview, just see, we know what we're doing. I don't think they really did, but they were like, we know what we're doing. And so I go interview and get it. And I remember my very first day working there, I sat in a group. One of the patients did a first step. It was a pretty terrible story, but does his first step. And for some reason I left that day and I went straight back to that director and I said, thank you so much for putting me here and thinking that I could do this work. I love it. This is what I want to do. So fortunately, after that internship.
Can you tell people what you mean by first step, just in that? Why was that so pivotal for you to see?
Well, I guess the person was doing a first step after having been caught with child pornography. Really great person, but just had made some, not great decisions. And so sitting in that and actually hearing his story that brought him to where he was to make the decisions that he did, really shifted my thinking. And because I was a young mid-20s woman going into the system, and this program was all men 18 and up, pretty much majority middle-aged men. So we'll talk some about this, but I pretty much fit all of their arousal template. Right. And so it was like a small minnow walking into sharks is how it felt for me that first day. And so hearing him and hearing past that, I had a professor that would say it's hard to hate people from up close. And so actually getting up close to someone and their story, it just shifted things for me, because he talked about, his journey to the behaviors that he was doing. And really, because the part of the first step is identifying that they're powerless to their addiction and, passing that over to a higher power. And so he was going through that journey and just identifying the areas that he was powerless in. And he incorporated some of his past, like traumas and those sorts of things as well. And then the consequences of his behaviors too. So it was just really impactful. I was probably sweating, sitting in the corner, like a rosacea flare up, stressed to the max. Anyway, I would love to have a snapshot of me. I can remember exactly where I was sitting. And so then after that went and just was super grateful that they saw that I could do that work. Somehow got fortunate enough in that year, really loved the staff there, really worked well with the staff there. A position happened to come available for me to be a primary therapist, and ended up being able to stay on as a primary therapist for that program, and stayed there a number of years. And through that, because it was a sex addiction treatment center, was able to go on and get my CSAT. So thousands upon thousands of hours working specifically with sex addiction and betrayed partners. So that's the journey. It feels like one I didn't choose, if that makes sense. I know I didn't have to do the path that I did. Definitely wasn't an active decision. It feels though, if you would have told me 10 years ago I would be doing this, I probably would have ran for the hills. I say it all the time. It's just the Lord, his guidance. And, fortunately, I guess my trust in him or something, but my trust just to lean into that and where he was taking it, because I love the work, or else I wouldn't keep doing it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, that's a key takeaway you're starting off with, is just, from a Christian perspective, when you can understand where people have been, when you hear their story, when you actually disciple them and sit with them over coffee or in therapy or in their life, then you see the patterns that led to what we would see on surface being an awful thing, whether it's affairs or child pornography or pornography in general or trafficking or, being a pimp or whatever the situation is. We have this lens as humans, and especially as Americans, where we look at those things as worse behaviors and more gross and awful. And although they are terrible and they need consequence, when you actually get to know the person, right, it never started off with that. That's what they wanted to be when they grew up.
Right. And that's what I say even to my clients. Now I'm like, I'm sure when you were 12, you weren't thinking, hey, I'm going to be addicted to pornography when I'm 35 and watch my marriage go to shambles and end up having to spend thousands of dollars working on myself. That's not your life dream, And so, but being able to sit down, and one of the first things I do with my clients is a timeline and a trauma egg. And so doing the trauma egg with them, I realized this pretty early on as an intern working. I started hearing parts of my story and their story. And so I was like, uh-oh. Yeah. I was like, and so, but being able to hear like, well, this impacted, how did they end up in that seat and I ended up in this one?
Yeah.
Right. And
so the
like,
outliers.
Yeah. I was like, we're really not that different. Just some different paths got taken where you're sitting there and I'm sitting here. So that really helped because, I'm sure like y'all have heard some really awful, terrible things, both that have happened to people and that people have done. And whenever I remember, well, you were once a 10-year-old and this happened to you. Okay, I can feel that. I can have a lot more empathy for that. So it's just getting up close to people and not being afraid about that.
That's good. And especially for, being a woman and that being scary. I always think super highly of you ladies who are being CSATs because it is a really different, scary world to walk into compared to for us. It's scary for different reasons, but just that, that part is super brave. So
Thanks.
proud of you.
Yeah.
Brent, tell us about you, man.
Man, I don't know if
You
I
gotta
can follow that
yeah.
up. I just don't have that story.
Shouldn't have let ladies go first.
Right, no. My story is much more short. I ended up getting a job at the children's home and did MST for a little bit, and then we switched the program, and we're looking at options. And I think you had already went through, I think, and did your CSAT and a few other people. And so it was presented as an opportunity. I'd never thought about it, but I really do believe it was a God thing because I jumped on board in, 2016? I think March of 2016, I went to Florida for Mod 1 and came back scared to death. I was like, what?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I think I actually talked to you.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is this?
It was really overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so after that, it was just a multitude of things. And so I definitely prayed about it. And I'm like, is this something that I want to do? And I remember taking that time and saying, like, I don't know, like, I want to really make a educated decision on this and pray about it. So I can, just follow what the Lord has for me. And so it really turned into something that I'm so very thankful for because I've been able to help a lot of people since then, going through all the mods and to where I'm at right now. It's just, it's amazing to, meet with people and get to that place where it's so much vulnerability, but so much healing can happen too.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think people listening. So CSAT is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. It's a certification through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, called ITAP for short. And so it's a 4-module training. So you go, Mod 1, it's 5 days. Mod 2, you wait a little while and then do it, and you do. And then Mod 3, Mod 4, and then you have 40 hours of consultation, I think, something like that. 30. Yeah, 30 hours of consultation during. I'm like, I don't remember. But yeah, so you have another CSAT who's walking you through cases and doing these things. So it's, for me, I felt like kind of part 1 is the summary of what is sex addiction. Part 2 is betrayal trauma and how it affects the family. Part 3 is really heavy on trauma, and part 4 is kind of a summary of it all. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty good, accurate.
Yeah. I don't remember.
Yeah, right. So I've had to say this a few times.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's like, I felt like it was better than my master's degree. Because it was just so specific, but it also covered a wide range of things. And then, alcohol, drugs, family systems and kind of insert it, into the into the CSAT model, because you're like, we're looking at sex addiction, but it all plays out the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So let's talk about that for a second. Why do you think, well, first, we just said what a CSAT is, but why is that so distinctly different, or why are there so few CSATs? So I think there's only like 2,700 or something in the country.
Not a lot.
I didn't know that was, I didn't know it was that low.
It might be larger. I might be making that completely up. Patrick Karn's going to email me this afternoon. Billy, there's a lot more.
Right.
But it's still super low number.
Yeah, it's a pretty low number.
Yeah. I need I need Chip to be able to like Google stuff and
fact check.
Yeah, fact check me, Chip. Look,
Make a
can
little
you Google and see how many
fact check.
CSATs there are?
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much differing opinions on, is sex addiction real? Is it not real? And I see that quite often through various avenues. It's just, people don't necessarily agree with the sex addiction model, and it's just really all over the place. And so a lot of differing opinions on that. But,
yeah, I know when I got it, it was 2015-ish, I think, or 14. And like the Psychology Today would not publish anything about sex addiction. They were real pro pornography in some articles, sex workers, all those kind of things. And so, there's that tension of the world saying, well, hold on, the BDSM, all these things are perfectly relevant, fine things to do, and then you get the training and it's like, well, most of this comes out of trauma and most of this comes out of like early abuse and early neglect and all these things. And so, it is an interesting kind of thing to walk through just in the CSAT world. And they were arguing at I think Mod 4 for me about whether porn addiction and sex addiction are the same or separate.
Yeah, I think that started in like my Mod 1.
Yeah.
I had a pretty feisty bunch of people.
Can you talk to me about that difference, or to people about that difference?
The difference in porn and sex addiction?
Yeah, so I want people to understand that not everybody who
watches porn is
a sex addict. Yeah. Do we believe that, I guess, that's what I'm asking.
I do.
Okay. Yeah.
I lean into that.
Brent, what do you think?
That porn addiction and sex addiction are obviously different?
Yeah.
I would agree. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think porn addiction, the way I talk about it with my clients, is like falls under the umbrella of sex addiction, because it's still, if we get really scientific with it, still playing with those sexual neuropathways.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I think it falls under it. Sometimes what happens though with I see a lot of betrayed partners.
Right.
And so a good many of the partners in their mind, I think, say, oh, well, my husband's a porn addict, so it's not that bad as this person's husband who acted out sexually outside of the relationship. Whenever we get digging, we realize it has the same impact. Mm-hmm. And so I say that to say, for the sex addict or the porn addict, it has the same impact. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I've seen, and I saw this a good bit whenever I was working inpatient, is so many of the guys that I worked with started out as porn addicts, and then they were like, I would never cross that line. I would never cross that line. And, my answer was always yet. You won't do that yet.
Yeah,
I agree.
And so many of them would start out with just pornography, and then the next thing they know, they're, downtown looking for a prostitute to hook up with, and they think, how did I get here? Well, look at what you were watching. It wasn't good enough anymore. It wasn't giving you the hit anymore. So that's why I put it under the same umbrella. Not necessarily the exact same thing because of the behaviors, but definitely under the same umbrella, the way that I see it.
Mm-hmm. Brent, what do you think?
I mean, I when she said that, I was like, that's exactly how I view it. Just as it's a sort of this subcategory in a way, but it definitely can lead to further stuff down the road. But I think also to just make this known, there's a lot of people who may look at pornography, but it wouldn't technically be pornography addiction. And so there's obviously a distinction there. Mm-hmm. It has to be causing a significant amount of issues. Maybe if you're looking at pornography 3 hours a day, every day of the week, then that's obviously a huge problem. So that's one of the factors. So there's a lot of different factors that play into it. And I do see when people schedule and are kind of looking at a possibility of having a pornography addiction, there tends to be, this overgeneralization of, if you look at porn, then obviously you're a porn addict. Mm-hmm. And it's so much more complex than that.
Well, it's the same as, something like alcohol. Well, because you have a drink or you drink alcohol, does that make you an alcoholic? No.
Right.
Right. And
you might cope poorly with it.
Right. You might cope poorly with it, but Dr. Carnes has come up with, going back to being, kind of this debatable thing in the psychology world, he's come up with, hopefully for the next DSM, is working to get sex addiction in there, or something, impulsivity, whatever.
Which is unreal that it's not in there.
Right.
Especially based on the last 10 years of culture.
It's a process disorder. And so even that process disorders, right, they have eating disorders, but not the other ones in there. So anyway, but all that to say, it is looking at how's it impacting your life. And it's a whole list of criteria that therapist can go through and that CSATs are provided to say, okay, is it just problematic? Is this just impacting your morals? Which I see a lot with Christian men, even women. Or is this actually an addiction? Are there these things?
Yeah. Last week or week before last, I had the Center for Sexual Exploitation on, and she said that they did a study recently and that the girls scored a point higher in viewing pornography in the last month than the boys did. And that was the first time ever that they had seen that type of statistic. Wow. And she sent me the links and the articles and all that kind of stuff. So if anybody wants them, just message us in. But because of the access, right, it's just increased the women watching it. And then a lot of teen girls especially are watching it because they want to keep up with what their boyfriend's watching or their husband's watching or whatever. And so, we've seen this huge uptick. Now, I'm not saying that's across the board that ththey're watching it more. But I think the last stat I saw was like 36% of Protestant women in the last month have seen pornography.
Yeah, and a huge uptick since COVID. That was a huge shift up.
Yeah, 18%, I think, something like that, like Pornhub stats or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked about this, that whenever COVID hit, within probably that's last summer, I heard the stat that, and I could be getting it off, but it's still probably true. Pornhub, just that one website, had more hits a day than Amazon, Facebook, and Instagram. And y'all, I was on Amazon a lot. So, I'm thinking, whenever I heard that, I thought, oh my gosh.
It's a lot of porn.
Yeah. I was like, oh no. And so anyway, but just like comparing it to that, think about how much of a problem even just social media is. Well, then compare that to that one website. That's just one place.
And that's just Pornhub. Now you have OnlyFans, which made a huge impact last year. And
this is a whole new thing.
It's a whole new thing. And I think COVID really, pushed that forward. I don't know any statistics on OnlyFans, but I know it's very, very, lucrative for the people that are doing it. And it's just a whole different level.
My favorite thing, and look, me and Olivia talk about this all the time, just how you can laugh at stuff as CSAT. So, if you're listening and you hear us laughing about something and it seems crass, it's just because we do this all day long. But my favorite is the Facebook ads for OnlyFans, and it's like workout videos and sports and like, teaching you to do whatever. And it's like, that's like 1% of what is on there.
Right.
But it gets you in there, right? It's the gateway drug to OnlyFans ads. But it's like, they're not quite crossing the line of like, hey, let's put pornography. So for people not listening, OnlyFans is a website where you can have people come on, pay as little as $2 a month or a day or whatever it is to kind of view whatever material you're putting out. And it's all very sexually exploitive. And so you can have, that's the other increase, is you have women who can make a guy do something for money. And so OnlyFans is prostitution.
You're right. It's an entirely different level. Yeah. So Pornhub and OnlyFans are completely different,
right?
Because you have that interaction, and then you have a lot of people who would maybe not engage in prostitution normally, but they're doing it virtually, and
they don't see it's the same,
right?
Right, and then
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say you have this power versus money, and people are on there and trying to get them to do stuff or, whatever it may be.
Well, and it's not much different than webcamming,
right,
which falls under the sex addiction umbrella as well.
Right.
The way that I see it with all of that, it's not much different than webcamming. So anyway, I see it as the same with OnlyFans. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's webcamming. It's just
got a,
new name.
Not as sketchy of a name.
Yeah, and again, the whole culture was like, well, you do you. You know, if you're going to make that money and people are going to pay for it, do it. And it's like, again, it's pretending that that's not negatively impacting that person. You know, that the person, yeah, they're making money, but they're still selling themselves to strangers anonymously. You know, but they're on both ends, right? You have this disassociation. You have people who are watching it and paying for it and buying it and wouldn't go buy a prostitute on the street. But you also have women who would never be strippers now stripping because it's disconnected. They're not standing on they're not dancing on a pole on a stage with a bunch of strangers who can grab them and hurt them. They're now able to do that same thing.
Right. I mean, it's dissociation through the camera. I mean, you're just looking at the camera and there's not a actual person on the other side. Then you just see the comments and the interactions. But, you know, it's just a different vibe altogether.
Yeah, that's crazy. So we got real deep real quick.
Yep.
So tell me what makes up a sex addict, like somebody who becomes a sex addict.
I mean, it's like I said just a couple minutes ago. I run through like very basic criteria in my head. So I start looking at how are your behaviors impacting your relationship, if they're married, even if they are married, if they're not married. I look at how is it impacting your friendships, your social life, how is it impacting your occupation. Again, I've heard some wild stories about how it's impacted those things, and then start looking at, okay, whenever you first started these behaviors to where you are now, sitting in my office, what's been the escalation is the big thing that I look at that starts to help me classify and give the name addict.
So you might start, looking at magazines or softcore stuff, and then you start looking at pornography, and then you buy a prostitute, and then you buy a couple prostitutes, and then you start having an affair.
Right. And if it's like, if we go back to that pornography addiction, it's looking at, okay, so you started out with, and I mean, like, these are some sex addict words, but you start out with more vanilla pornography, and now here you are on X, Y, or Z, and it's how did I get here? How long? You talked about that. Is it 3 hours a day, every day a week, or is it, what does that look like? That's kind of the tough part, especially living down in the Bible Belt, is I'll have people come sit in my office and say, I have a porn addiction. I can't stop. Like, okay, well, talk to me about it. And, they're a Christian and, believer, and they watch porn once every 6 months.
Right.
Right. And so that looks a little, for me, I'm like, okay, there might be a morality piece there going. So it just takes some conversation and asking questions that I would say aren't super comfortable to most of the public.
No,
it was like you said, I mean, once you say it and talk about it so much, it just isn't that big of a deal to talk about, which I'm really grateful that it's gotten that way. As far as, in my work, to be able to talk with people to help them. But I look for like escalation, impact on occupation, how much money are you spending, how's it impacting relationships,
value system.
Right. Yeah, is it dangerous? Is it not? Right. Yeah, those sorts of things.
Okay.
I mean, I was going to say all of those things, but I'm also really careful of using labels as well, because you said the Christian guy who looks at it once every 6 months, and so I'm very intentional when I get new people, regardless of if you're a quote addict or not an addict. If your goal is to not look at it and engage in it and really do some work on your life, then we're going to work on that. So it's not about the label. It's about what are your goals and what are we working towards? Is this something that you want to quit? Is this something that you really desire to just not be in your life anymore and really push forward to that?
I would agree with that. I'm really careful with it too. That's why, it takes, I would agree. Whenever you're saying that, I was thinking if it's causing the person distress, right? If they come in and watch porn and it's not a problem for them, like, okay, I'll back away from that for now.
Right.
But if they're coming in and it's every so often and it's causing them some distress, that's the other thing that stands out.
Yeah, I would say it's such a tightrope walk, because when you start seeing the rest of the people in their life, that's when the addict label is good and bad, because there is some level that they need to understand, the spouse or the husband or the wife or the kids or whoever's impacted, that this is not going to just go away. If it's the guy who watches it once every 6 months, then you do some therapy, it should be kind of knocked out, maybe another 6 months, but for those who are struggling with full-on addiction and they're in the midst of it, there's going to be a relapse plan. There's going to be, and we'll get to that stuff in a minute, but So I think it's sometimes helpful for them to understand this, calling you an addict, it isn't you. You're not, you shouldn't identify as an addict. But at the same time, I need to be aware that there's some neurological things that are science that are broken that need to be healed. And that's not going to it's not a choice.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
It's not like, oh, should I eat white bread or wheat bread? It's, if these things aren't in place and you're not far enough along in recovery, then you're going to slip up. I was talking to somebody this morning. It's like, he was like, well, I haven't had any issues and, and then I went out of town and I was freaking out, and I'm like, okay, well, what's your 3 circle? And did you put things in perspective and, call somebody and, all the things we know to do. And he's like, no. And I'm like, right. So it's like an alcoholic. You can not drink for 6 months, but then you end up in a bar with some friends and, oh man, all those desires come back. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what people need to understand when it comes to addiction is that neural pathway is always there. It can be pretty deadened and removed, but if you put all the right combination of things in place, then...
Mm-hmm. I talk about it with my clients, like thinking about a ditch, because those neural pathways are dug out and carved out in your brain. And so I think about it as like, okay, if I have a ditch that's already dug, when it rains, that's where the water's naturally going to go, is back to that ditch that's been dug. Well, we need to dig another ditch and not give that one as much attention, keep digging in that one,
right,
and give some more attention over here into digging new ditches, because those aren't working for the water anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so that takes time. Exactly what you're saying.
Right. I love analogies.
Yeah.
I have an analogy I use, and we were talking about how I didn't have that much of a Lake Charles accent, but it's about to come out. So I talk to clients, who are local, and I use a boudin analogy. Like, okay, well, you say, okay, this isn't good for me, which is really not, and then so you say, I'm not going to do it. But what happens when you pass by Rabbitohs and then you smell it, and you're like, oh man, I've not had boudin in like 2 years. It smells so good. I'm going to go, and so there's that immediate, response of, oh, well, that neural pathway's still there.
Oh, definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic when it comes to the brain and addiction that people, I think, underestimate a lot.
Right.
But yeah, I think the main goal for all three of us, and I know y'all would both say this, is that alleviating shame is the main process of not labeling.
Right.
And so talk to me a little bit about, calling it an intimacy disorder versus addiction. I don't know if you do that or how you...
I don't know what I do. I'm just sitting here trying to think. Sometimes I joke, if you've watched The Office, I joke I'm like Michael Scott. I'm like, I start a sentence and hope it ends somewhere. And so that's it. I've joked that I've done that as a therapist for years. I look at it as like an intimacy disorder. What I really look at it as is an attachment disorder.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's really what I've noticed in people over the years. And when there's an attachment disorder, there's going to be intimacy issues.
Right.
And so I really lean into, like with the assessments that we can give at CSAT, the experiences in close relationships grid. Right. I really lean into looking at, and that's also how I was trained. So it lines up really well. CSAT work and MFT work, I think, marry really well together.
Definitely.
And so I view it more as an attachment issue, and with attachment, there's going to be intimacy issues. If that makes sense.
No, that's good. Brent, can you talk a little bit about, so we talked about like if you're a clinician looking at someone and saying, well, what's a sex addiction, what's a sex addict, and somebody who struggles with attachment or intimacy. Can you tell me a little bit of the makeup of kind of their childhood? Is there a typical thing that happens for them when they're little? Kind of what is the kind of preset things that happen? So if you're a parent, you're like, I don't want my kid turning out to be a sex addict. Or if you're a person struggling with sex addiction, to look at your childhood, what are some of the kind of common themes?
I think, with the people that I work with, there's just been a lot of, parents just taking things for granted and not being intentional with their kids. And so these clients now are grown-ups and, weren't invested in, or their parents may not have even been there, or there's just, I see it so often, where it's either one parent, both parents, they're just not either involved, or there's just some kind of trauma early on. There also is obviously, trauma maybe from sexual abuse, stuff like that too, which kind of makes a segue into different addictive behaviors too. So I mean, it varies, but usually, it's not necessarily a secure attachment. Mm-hmm. Most of the time. There are always going to be exceptions, and I definitely have had people score in the secure realm on the ECR as well that mm-hmm. weren't necessarily struggling with narcissism or anything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just different things happen in life at different points. A lot of times it's childhood, sometimes it's later on, from other types of trauma. But I really do think it's definitely rooted in some sort of trauma somewhere, even if it's big or little or, consistently over time.
Yeah. What would you say?
I agree. What I've seen is a good bit of family makeup. I've worked with some individuals, though, that have come, whenever I've explored it with them, what appear to be fairly healthy family dynamics. Those are very few and far between. And then whenever I get to talking with them about it, it's the individuals that were surrounding them. So like teachers, coaches, ministers, those sorts of things, that something happened with them. And they didn't necessarily label what happened with them as abusive or traumatic. They were, and really they were taken advantage of. So while they can say, well, my parents were really healthy, I saw a good marriage, yada, yada. Outside of that, it's, well, these things were actually happening to me and I didn't realize that would be labeled as mm-hmm. traumatic. Those are really few and far between. So I like with that secure attachment piece. If I see a secure attachment on an ECR, I'm pretty direct. And
Can you tell them what an ECR is?
The experiences in close relationship scale. Okay. And mm-hmm. so that measures the attachment style. So you've got secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant, or anxious avoidant. And so looking at that, if I see someone is secure and I've known them for a little bit, I'll typically let them know that I call BS basically mm-hmm. on that and talk through why I think that with them. And then they can work to find themselves once I talk that in the other areas. Now they may have that with a spouse, but thinking about how attachment forms in childhood, it really can bring up some good conversation. But I mean, typically there is some sort of childhood abuse in some way that's happened, or neglect that's happened to the adult person that I'm seeing. One of the directors that I worked with in Mississippi had a great thing that she would say is that the war on addiction is really the war on childhood trauma. Mm-hmm. And that just seems really fitting for most of the people that I see.
That's good. Yeah, I think for me, you're both right. I mean, it's a wide range, but I'd say the general theme is people think they had a great childhood, and that their parents were great, and they may have been well-intentioned, but in the, and we all kind of typically see people who are still alive, so they could be anywhere from, let's say, adults 40 to 65, 70 who are dealing with addiction. It's like they grew up in a specific era, where dads weren't emotional and weren't connected. And so a lot of times I've seen, a lot of low warmth, mm-hmm. a lot of rigid, parenting, or just on the opposite end where it's like, nope, like you said, Brent, like nobody's there. And so there's no attachment and there's all this disconnection. Right. They're just really bad boundaries around affection and security. And then, you have the culture of military folks being deployed and, having magazines and having the culture of that. And then you move into the 90s when the internet hits. Right. And so it's like you still have all these family systems. I think that's so good, like the war on, childhood trauma, because that's the kind of primer, mm-hmm. Is the childhood trauma, the lack of attachment, the abuse that's going on. And it doesn't even have to be big T traumas. It can be these little T traumas. And then the 90s, the internet hits. And then in the last 12 years, the phone hits. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what the makeup of 20 to 30-year-olds are in the next year, because they have all the same things that these adults are really struggling with, that's destroyed their lives, except for now they have steroids injected into their culture, when it comes to sex addiction and all those things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just a whole different dynamic now, and I mean, I think...
Right, because you could be great parents,
right,
and be attached and be attuned, but you give your kid a phone at 12,
you're just, and really what's going on is, not to segue into phone addiction, but I mean, that's a really big thing. Because you're constantly looking for that dopamine rush. You're looking for the like, you're looking for, this new thing, and you just keep scrolling. We are addicted as a people, we are addicted to a scroll now. And so it keeps, getting in one form or another form. And so, like you said, I mean, you could have a great family that are trying to be intentional and they're trying to really do the right thing, and then their kid has a phone and, is just kind of going off the deep end with, whatever it may be, with porn or social media and whatnot. So,
well, and that goes into some of the attachment, intimacy piece too, because whenever the phone comes into play, and especially whenever pornography comes into play, I was just having this conversation with one of my clients, is it creates that pseudo connection that they think that they are connecting with people because they're seeing these people online or communicating with them virtually. So they think that they're connecting with people, but all the research shows that connection is actually sitting with someone face to face, getting that right brain to right brain interaction. And through the phone, you aren't going to get that. It's more of a pseudo connection. And so it's, it just sets kids up into that. I mean, and I think it's in Mod 1, maybe they talk about contemporary versus classic sex addicts. So it really sets them up for that more contemporary path of just not knowing how to connect with people when they get face to face, which increases stress and anxiety. And now we start seeing social anxiety. So what are you going to do for that? Go back to where you know how you can connect. So it just really, I agree. It's going to be really interesting and probably pretty sad to see what this next upcoming of kids is going to be looking like.
Yeah, it's going to be a train wreck. Yeah, I was telling the staff on Monday, if you're, there's going to be a point, and I would challenge any clinician listening to this, any pastor listening to this, anybody who's leading people and teenagers, the next 10 years, we're only going down. And that's not to be hopeless. I think we have the ability, and God has the ability to change hearts and minds and do all kinds of things. But based on statistics and how many CSATs there are, which Chip couldn't find the national number, but it's 100 and something, 500 square miles of Shreveport. So that's nothing.
I mean, I'm the only one in Lake Charles.
Right.
In between Houston and Baton Rouge. Yeah,
we have people drive here from Longview, from Texarkana, from Alexandria, because we're the only ones doing it. And when I started, I think I was the only one in 300 square miles of Shreveport. So, I mean, that's a great thing that we've had 100 more people kind of join the group in the last decade. But that's 100 people out of thousands and thousands of clinicians. And my problem is that if you're seeing now, that used to be 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you didn't have to be a CSAT because you could see people who it wasn't affecting, let's say. But now the weird thing will be this next decade is that the 20 to 30 year olds who are going to need therapy in the next 5 to 10 years, they're all going to have these issues because of statistics. Most of the boys are going to have watched hardcore pornography and had some addiction. Most of the girls are going to be struggling with self-identity and self-harm. And if you're not equipped as a clinician, then you miss the whole thing. You don't ask the right questions. You don't dig into that childhood trauma, those arousal templates and all those things. And it just scares me for the masses. It's it's hard enough to get people in therapy, but then you get people in therapy and they're not with somebody who's trained, and we know the problems that creates. Right.
Yeah, I've encountered where you were referencing this a little bit earlier, but where they sought out a therapist and it was that more, well, you do you, this is the way that you're exploring yourself mentality. And real big eye roll to that whenever it comes to this piece, because I think before going that route, I would encourage people to really explore what that's doing for them before just saying, okay, well, this is fine. These things that you're doing seem healthy, right? To really, because I've had people sit down with, I think what they thought was a CSAT, and it ended up being a sex therapist, which are great and they're needed. And for someone that's struggling with a sex addiction, it just told them, hey, I'm fine to do what I'm doing. And so it's also, I think, for the people that are struggling to be educated on the type of therapist that they are seeking out. If they need a sex therapist for what's going on in their life, great. Seek that out. They're very helpful, really knowledgeable in what they're doing. And if it's something that you're struggling with and finding distressing and impacting relationships, seek out someone that may have, even if it says sex addiction therapist, it,
might not be the thing.
It might not be an addiction. It might just be an impulsivity or something that causes distress. And, we know what we're doing with that.
Yeah.
At least I like to think we do.
Yeah. And Brent, talk about the kind of scales that we can use and MRI, what's it called? The
MRI.
Yeah, not the MRI.
MRI.
We need to do MRIs on me right now. No, the
SDI.
SDI, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, brain went blank.
You're talking which scales you're talking about?
Well, any of the ones that we can use on the website, like Recovery Zone and all that stuff. Like we have a unique list and group of things that we can use that other people can't.
Right. I mean, we have the ability to do the sexual dependency inventory. We can't talk today. And so that's what, one thing that I try to do, relatively quickly on, maybe obviously not the first session, but even before then, I would encourage anybody that's kind of questioning, they can go take the sexual addiction screening tool,
The SAST
-R on the ITAP website, or is it on Recovery Zone? I'm not sure.
I think it's ITAP.
It's through ITAP.
Google
Yeah.
it.
They just changed all kind of stuff recently, so I'm still trying to get used to it. But anyway, I think there's tons of different tools that we can use, and obviously if you have somebody that's not trained or doesn't have access to those things, you're almost taking a shot in the dark sometimes. And just to couple off what you said about sex therapy, there's a lot of controversy between the two groups, but there's a time and place for both. And I think that there's definitely people who have struggled with sexual addiction, but in other ways could also benefit from sex therapy as well.
And tell me what sex therapy is for those that don't know.
Sex therapy, and I don't want to botch this because this is not the actual definition, but it's just working on trying to figure out how to have a healthier sex life and what that looks in a healthy way versus any kind of dysfunctionality. So correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was pretty good.
I'm not a sex therapist, so
Right.
that's good to me.
Yeah, sounds good. Alexandra Katakakis, is that?
Right.
That's right. She's
like
probably
cringing right now.
cringing in California. Like, who's botching sex therapy?
No, but she's amazing, and that's one thing that I do want to, us to do here is to get some people trained, in that same thing, because it's like you have people come in and deal with the dysfunction, but then I do the best I can to tell them what healthy sex is, but everybody has a different. I mean, that's why it's difficult, because it's like from a faith perspective, as Christians, sex is great. Right, that's the truth. God has given it to us to find connection, to find intimacy, to procreate, to bring our kids in the world. But we have this huge culture that sex, just in general, has such heavy shame.
Right.
I was saying, just the recent, most of the last 10 years, the stats have been like 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have been sexually abused by 18. So it's like you have all these kids, these minors who have experienced sexual trauma. Very few of them go to therapy. Well, how do you think they're going to have healthy sex lives? And so I find this huge shame on guys struggling with sexual sin and brokenness and porn and all these kind of things. But I see just as much dysfunction on the spouse's side of not desiring sex or being turned off to sex or being sexually anorexic, and those two things just pairing together. I say all the time, like, your guy who struggles with porn, every 6 months, it's like, let's say once a month, right? It's like, hey, every once in a while I'll screw up and I'll have my phone or I'll do this, and then I end up slipping up. And then I'm like, okay, what's going on? Well, my wife doesn't touch me. She's not kind to me. She talks poorly to me, and then they come in for session, and for 4 months you can just be talking about how bad the porn was. But both things are damaging to the relationship.
Right.
And I'm not saying that pornography is less than. I think with pornography, it can feel like an affair. It's an affair for most people in their minds, and so that can be super traumatic. So that's a little different. But the reality is with healthy sex, you have to be working on all of it. The couple has to be trying to figure out how do we both take responsibility for our responsibility in the cycle. It's not your fault that your husband or your wife cheated or watches porn. But what's going on with me is that is my view of it healthy
Right.
outside of them, Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had this picture in my head of an umbrella. I mean, it really, you have to work on multiple layers here, right? You know, or even viewing it from like a systems perspective, like there's multiple different systems going on that you need to address. It's not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of work with the partners.
Mm-hmm.
So I end up working with the betrayed partners a good bit. And the way that I frame it to them, and this is some of the trauma egg work, because I even have my partners do trauma eggs. And if I get my couple together, I'll have them share them with each other once we are safe. But anyway, so looking at the roles that they've played in their family, and then look at, okay, how is that role playing out with your partner now?
Mm-hmm.
So like if I have a partner that's a fixer, for example, okay, how are you trying to fix your husband's pornography addiction or webcamming, whatever it may be, which really just pushes him away, right? Not saying that they're the cause of it, but what role are you playing, really trying to appease your own anxiety, your own things that are going on, and how is that impacting your relationship with your spouse? So I look at it as like a role and a responsibility.
Right, and I'll just say this: when I'm in session with people, you know, let's say the husband is saying, "Well, I want," you know, that's one of the things through the work. It's like, well, they don't have, you know, I don't have sex enough, so I have to watch porn. It's like, no, you're fully responsible to control yourself regardless of the circumstances. I get that that's difficult, and that makes it, you know, harder for you to not do. But at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility for you. And then if I had the spouse in here that's the betrayed partner, right, we have to say, okay, I get that this was very harmful for you and that this was, you know, but how are we going to move forward? And so it's like, it's such a dance of getting them to both take responsibility without feeling shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, with the betrayed partners that I've worked with, what I'll see is whenever the addict, and I'm just going to use that language, Stephanie Carnes has actually switched it to participating partner and betrayed partner to not label the addiction.
I like that.
But so I've tried to change my language with that, but with the participating partner, when they start reaching out for help, then I'll see the betrayed partner, all of a sudden their behaviors will start acting out. It's like a thermostat. So the participating partner is resetting the thermostat to 70. Well, they've been at 72. And so the betrayed partner's not, you get back up here with me. This is where we're used to being. So then I have to talk with them about, okay, so the amount of money that you spent last month, or you gaining weight, or, you know, you blocking in the bed with pillows. Mm-hmm. Are you doing that out of fear? Are you doing that out of punishment? Are you doing that out of a trauma response? Like having to explore the behaviors that they're doing, because it is trying to like find this balance in the relationship again, where they've lived in chaos, and now we're trying to shift that and just bring them to this new shift, this new temperature for the couple.
Mm-hmm. Brent, you had something?
I was just gonna say, you know, I mean, it really could be any or all of that, you know, anger, you know, just fear, you know, there's a lot of fear, you know, so it really just depends, you know, it's great to explore that with, you know, with the partner as well.
Yeah. I think the unique thing about it is when you're a betrayed partner, and you have to realize that, 80-something% of them have like PTSD.
PTSD. Yeah. Just a training with Dr. Kevin Skinner, and the numbers are, really, really sad for the partners. Really sad.
Right.
And the likelihood, like if we're looking at adverse childhood experience, not to go like too far down this rabbit hole.
No, go ahead.
But if we're looking at adverse childhood experiences of a betrayed partner who's experiencing PTSD symptoms after discovery from the participating partner, they will experience PTSD symptoms less than partners who have experienced gaslighting from the participating partner. And so those experience the symptoms stronger than those that have, you know, an ACEs score, adverse childhood experiences. And so that's part of what makes it really difficult, I think, for the partner when the participating partner, the addict, is starting to seek out help. They don't believe it,
right?
Because of the gaslighting,
and rightly
that's
so.
happened.
Yeah. Because that trust has been. Somebody said, you know, trust is lost in buckets and gained in drips. And I was like, that's such a good
That is good, yeah.
quote.
It's a great one.
But it is about 80% experience PTSD symptoms.
Yeah. It's tough. I think it makes me, I'm going to go on a tangent for a second, but it makes me think why is it, like, how do we change this? I guess that's where my brain goes. It's like, how do we prepare young women, young men to understand sex and healthy sex in a way? Because I think that's the missing piece that I've talked about a lot, is that sexual neglect idea. And so if kids don't understand that other people are going to, and not young kids, but as they grow right in their teenage years and their young adulthood, that other people are going to have porn addiction. They're going to have struggles with lust. They're going to have trauma. They're going to have these things. Those don't have anything to do with you. You know, they don't have anything to do with your worth and value. They don't have anything to do with, like, the way that you can have healthy sex or not healthy sex. You need to be working on what's happened to you and what's happened in your past and working through those things. Because I think one of the things that happens is, you know, I've had people who struggle with pornography, and it can be female. I have a lot. When we say men and women, we just kind of interchange those. But let's say you have a female who tells her husband or gets caught watching pornography, and the husband gets mad and tells her to leave. Well, that's pretty unlikely to happen. Like, that's a pretty low thing. Mm-hmm. But what I've seen a lot of things happening is a woman catches her husband watching pornography, and it's, you know, let's say it's a low number. It's a guy who watches it once a month, and then he gets kicked out and has to go live somewhere. I get that trauma response. But my question is that we have to do, and we all do this work, is to get the spouse to ask the question of, why am I so overwhelmed by them having a struggle? Mm-hmm. You know, why am I so floored by it? Because we've never talked about it. You know, we've been married 10 years, and we didn't talk about pornography in the beginning. We didn't even question these things. We just assumed that this would never happen. And so what I find is that we have to go back into, like, the richness of, hey, we both kind of committed to this thing not knowing what we were doing and not equipped. And now this thing's been dropped in the middle of it, and it's blown the whole thing up. And so what I see a lot is, once we get, I mean, this might take 3 years, right? Like, third year we're talking about this stuff. But the spouse will go, oh my gosh, yeah, we never had a chance. You know, like, this is not his fault. I was enabling him by letting him do whatever. I was enabling him by, you know, letting him, you know, do his thing and not holding him accountable. Like, that worked for me because I didn't know how to be married, and I didn't want to, you know, deal with that. And then you start finally getting real shame reduction because the couples are mutually both saying, hey, look, let's not blame each other. Let's not figure out whose fault it is. Let's just repair our own stuff. And that's when it gets really pretty. But like, man, that takes a long time.
Yeah, to get from the past to the here and now, right? And have this, you know, present/future focus, you know, sometimes it does take a while.
Yeah. They say it, you know, 2 to 3 years is the recovery process for sex addiction. And you tell people that, and they get really overwhelmed with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like I said, I do a good bit of work with couples, and I think about those, and I say to mine pretty often whenever they're in that blaming place, I'm like, okay, y'all, right now, what does it matter who's right? Like, why are we fighting for that? Let's just take a step back and breathe and look at what you're bringing to the table, because it is, I mean, you use the word blaming. So much of that starts to happen, especially with a couple that's been together for 10 years or 15 years. It's, you didn't tell me about this, you didn't do that, you didn't do this. Then, you know, that comes back on the partner, whoever's talking. So just, that can get really messy really quickly.
And so if you're not trained properly, then how do you not, you know, you have to understand this huge foundation of what most partners are going to be doing and what the trauma is. Because I've had people come to us and go, well, we saw this other therapist, but she just basically shamed me, you know, and talked about her marriage and her husband and their things, and projected all this stuff onto the client because they didn't understand. You know, I don't know if y'all have seen that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have them say, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've had them say, well, they just told me I needed to leave my husband.
Right.
Yes.
Like, what? You know, it was just, and I was like, what questions were asked to get you to that point? But, you know, I was told I just need to leave my husband, that I need to get out, that I need to kick him out. And that's not what the person that I'm sitting with is desiring at all. You know, their desire is to heal their relationship and rebuild it and repair. And I've had a number of them, even outside of sex addiction, say that I saw this therapist and I was talking to him about my husband, and they they tell me I just need to leave them.
I literally had that happen a couple months ago, like verbatim.
Mm-hmm. That's super common. Yeah, I think that would, I mean, the deeper level of that is the, therapists not being trauma informed and not having any training in trauma. And so you work up here. And nowadays, I just don't think that you can afford to do that. I think the culture is so traumatized and so disconnected. And like you said, Olivia, the phone has completely desensitized people to so many things. I mean, the fact that any teenager is allowed to have TikTok and dance, with no clothes on provocatively, and their parents are like, that's just what kids do, right? That's the most desensitizing thing.
Preteens.
Yeah, preteens.
Kids.
Yeah, 11 and 12-year-olds.
Even younger.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then there's 3-year-olds on TikTok. It's crazy. And all you have to do as a parent is get on there and scroll about 5 little scrolls up, and then you should know this is super inappropriate. But the fact that it's even a thing, is insane. All right, I know I went down the rabbit hole. We talked about porn addiction. Okay, how has been being a CSAT and a Christian? How's that been difficult or beneficial?
This was one of those whenever you sent me this last night that I was thinking I could talk for hours about this. So I don't know if you want to go first before I get distracted.
Olivia's an 8, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Gotcha.
I'm with a wing 7, so anyway.
I mean, in my experience, it's, and considering, we're in the South, in the deep South, it's definitely something that I've probably dealt more with Christians who are struggling with pornography addiction equally as much as working with sex addiction too. So I do think that it's something that is I think I'm deviating from the question here, but it's something that's not being addressed, and churches don't really know how to handle it, and there's just a lot of unsurety on what to do. Like, I know I have these beliefs, but I'm still doing this. What's going on? And so I've seen quite a bit of people who I wouldn't even necessarily even label as addicts, but their goal is to this is not in my belief system. I don't want to do this. And so I've really worked with a lot of those guys on getting them to the point where they need to be and just refocusing. So I think it's really given me some sense of purpose, like I know I'm really doing this for God and really helping people overcome this stuff that would normally just feel lost and not really talk to anybody about it, because who are you going to go talk to? There's not really that outlet there. There's a lot of I don't want to go talk to my pastor, or they may judge me, or somebody in the church may judge me. And so I've been in that spot where, hey, I'm this neutral guy that's not connected to your congregation. Oh, and he works with sex addiction stuff, so I'm gonna go see you and work with you on this. So I think that in my community that's been very beneficial, to be sort of this neutral person to help people work through stuff. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. That was just good. The first thing that popped in my head. So it's definitely helped me as well, just have that like I said, sense of purpose to help those who are really struggling that normally wouldn't even mention it. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good, because it's true, because it's such a taboo thing, especially within the Christian culture. And so that's why I think it goes unmentioned so often. I was just thinking back on my time working at an inpatient facility where I was in a place where I couldn't identify my belief system. I mean, people could probably pick up on it, right? But I couldn't identify my belief system, and we worked in a 12-step versus a faith work, and so it's the higher power talk. And there were several times there that I just thought, y'all need Jesus. I was like, y'all just need Jesus. And there was another therapist there that we'd kind of laugh about that back and forth. I'm like, y'all need Jesus and y'all need a therapist. And they were in my group. So anyway, I was the therapist. But I think being able to practice now the way that I'm practicing really opens it up to be that neutral place for people to come talk to about it. And and this may be deviating some too, but I'm just thinking sometimes the struggle in being a female CSAT that works primarily, I have female sex addicts, but primarily it's men that present with that, at least up front. Women present with other things, and then I get to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and not to interrupt you, but I am. That's what I'm saying is going to change. Is right now we're still working off of the decades ago adults. Like we're all talking about seeing adults. And we're seeing 40, 35, 50-year-old people. So it's going to be mainly men, just because of statistics and because of the access and the way culture was. I'm super interested to see what CSATs are seeing in the next 5 to 10 years when we have 35-year-old women who have been teenagers during TikTok, and all these things. So anyway, so just for people listening, when you're hearing us say men, 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 it's not because men are, I think we're more susceptible. I think it's an important thing to say at this time. I think men are more susceptible to visual images than women are. Right. We're more stimulated by it. I mean, whether people believe it or not, men and women's bodies are different. You know, like most women don't want a nude picture of their husband during the day, but most men would totally like, a picture of their wife, and it would give them a biological reaction that it doesn't necessarily give to women, right? It gives you a different response from a visual sensation. And so in the past, a magazine, a Playboy, a Hustler, a softcore show, a woman's not going to visually get stimulated the same way sexually that a man will. They can, but on a spectrum, that's not going to happen. And so, but now we're shifting into the phone and the immersion of these visual images. And so women are getting and girls are getting just as aroused and just turned on because they're seeing it at such a larger level. And it's like at some point you have this breakthrough where it's like, oh, I saw that. It wasn't that stimulating. The guy saw it and they're like, oh man, it's automatically stimulating. But now it's like, well, now I've seen it 5 times. And so now it's super stimulating. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was thinking most of the men that I see intersex addiction through sex, most of the women I see intersex addiction through love.
Yep, there you go.
Right.
So, okay, what was this? Anyway, as a female working with men.
Sorry.
But that was good. As a female working with men, that's the other thing that I encounter in a pretty old school Christian world is men working with women. Like they're, in the church, sometimes there's the men aren't allowed to be alone with women. And so sometimes that will come into play and I'll have spouses ask those questions. And I'm like, look, I'm going to be asking personal questions. Sign a release and you're more than welcome to ask me. And I want, you can come in here and you can see how I work. That has to be really careful with disclosure stuff. But anyway, so, have that conversation pretty openly with them about why I'm doing what I'm doing and what that looks like. Right. So that's one hurdle I've seen doing this work in the Christian world. And the other is just really just how taboo it is. I think back, and fortunately now I'm able to reference scripture and verses and, able to touch and go into the Bible some with people. And from the beginning of time, how sex has been a part of and has veered people away from the Lord and from Christ, and how that's been such a big piece. And so being able to talk with people about that, I've seen be really impactful for their healing, because so many people get their higher power of, and that's using 12-step words, but get God confused with a parental figure. And so if I'm able to go back and do some of that work and say, okay, how can we be powerless to this? How can we, take a look at that? It can be really helpful. And I like doing that kind of work with people.
That's good. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that?
I just had a thought, not necessarily to tag on to that. It's just, another thing is I think it's really important as Christians for us to be intentional with our kids, and not shelter them and put them in a box and pretend like this is not part of the world, because they will encounter it in one way or another. And then just, sheltering them away from that is not necessarily going to get any results that are healthy in the long run, and I'm not saying to go immerse them and just say, hey, we're going to go look at, Pornhub. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think it's important to be intentional with our kids and, let them know, like, hey, this is what's out there. And, this is what the Bible says about it. This is what, really walking this out looks like. And, it's just education.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're looking for that, I think I don't know what episode it is, maybe 28 or 29. We do a episode on talking to your kids about sex,
Right.
developmental milestones, all those kind of things, sexual neglect. So if you want more information about that, go listen to that. But I think you're spot on. I think that's like everything in America right now, it's so polarized. You know, you said that, but that was literally a news article, 6 months ago. I can't remember the guy, but he's the ABC anchor. And his wife, they found out their daughter was watching porn. And so the wife was like, I sat down and watched it with her. And I explained that this, I sat and watched it and said, this is why this is fake. And this is what was real. And I just took it head on. It's like, okay, well, that's an extreme response, right? That's like, well, let's smoke crack together. And I'm going to tell you why this crack's bad for you. There's a level of inability to win. We were talking about this before the podcast, but like people think that they parented their kid in a way that, oh, well, I taught them the rules. I gave them structure, even if I gave them all the education, but they can't beat the phone. Mm-hmm. And they can't beat social media. They're 12, 13, 14. Their brain, their prefrontal, they don't have any ability to win. And yeah, they can maybe white knuckle it and get away with it a couple times, but eventually it's going to get them, And so I just think having a really good sexual education for your kids, teaching them biblically the right way to view it, not making it taboo, making it normal and comfortable, using the words penis and vagina, having safe touch, not safe touch, having these things. By the time they hit puberty and they, are going through these things, they're really equipped to not feel shame about it.
Right. And the shame. What do y'all think about, like, let's say you have a 13-year-old kid, parents find out that they were looking at porn, caught them, in the act. A lot of times what I've seen is a very extreme response to that. But then the shame really starts to come in at that point. What do y'all think about that, I guess? Or, I know you're asking the question.
No, it's fine.
But I
Thanks
just
for asking
feel like
me.
that's a
Get
great
to talk.
that's a great topic.
I think that's one of the number one core things that I think that creates sex addiction. And Ken Adams talks about that at the training a lot, that it only takes that one moment of your mom joking about masturbation or shaming you to still be in your brain when you're trying to have sex with your wife at 35, or, if you've masturbated at 35, it's like all this you feel that same guilt and that same shame. And so I tell parents all the time, don't walk in on them. If you open the door or see something or catch something, let the process finish out, go to them and say, hey, listen, I need to talk to you about something. It's going to be pretty intense and probably overwhelming. So take 5 minutes and go pray, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to come in there and we're going to have a conversation. Mm-hmm. And then go in and say, tell me about this. What was going on? How long has this been happening? I don't want you to feel shame. This is a normal thing. It's not a healthy thing depending on what the circumstances are, but let's talk about it, Mm-hmm. And every time I do a talk somewhere, I always get the question, like, is masturbation a sin? And then I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, it depends on the person and the circumstance and so many variables around it on whether I would think it was or wasn't. And they want just a general overview.
Yes or no.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I agree with that. And I really like the idea of don't walk in on them. Like, just
that was golden.
Yeah. I really like that. I'm going to steal it. And so
no problem.
I see that response where they either over respond or they don't respond at all.
Right.
So, like, whenever I'm doing a timeline with someone, it's, what happened? But whenever I'm doing a timeline with someone and they start talking about their sexual experiences, I'm like, okay, well, or they got caught with porn in their room or masturbating or whatever. Well, what did your parents say about that? Well, they didn't.
Right.
And so then it becomes this really passive, and that creates the shame too. Is the passivity around it, I see, creates the shame too, because then if they go to talk about it, that's shameful too.
Yeah. Well, and it's
just not as loud.
Yeah. Well, what you communicate as a parent is, we don't talk about this.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the problem, is they have a pornography situation or a masturbation situation or something that I would say is mild, and the parents go, well, we're not talking about that, and we never have talked about it. We've never given you any context before puberty. And then you have a sleepover or you have a situation where somebody is abusive to you, and you're like, well, these are all in the same category to me. And now I feel responsible because I did it, or I liked it, or it felt good, or it was some positive thing. And I'm definitely not going to go tell my parents because they've already communicated to me, we don't talk about this. Mm-hmm. And so I hear all the time, I mean, I know y'all do too, hey, I've never told anybody this. Mm-hmm. But when I was 8, I touched my sibling or my cousin touched me, And I felt such shame for 30 years, or 40 years. I had a 70-year-old client tell me that one time. And I'm like, you've been carrying this for 60 years?
Mm-hmm.
But it's because no one told them, you were just kids.
Mm-hmm.
Like that wasn't, they look back at, like, as an adult thinking that their 8-year-old self was thinking how they think about it at 35. And it's not the same thing. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just unsupervised, overstimulated, and exploring. And although that is abusive to the victim, it's not the same as being a perpetrator as an adult. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I unpack that for people, the shame reduction, and I start talking about the fact that that's very common, and the problem isn't them. It's a lack of support. It's a lack of resourcing. It's a lack of education from parents who didn't know any better. They had no clue how to talk about those things. There literally weren't books. My mom used to say, well, there's not a book on parenting. I'm like, well, there's a lot now. But there literally weren't things and resources to understand that. So I think that shame reduction piece is just super, super important.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that the church can get equipped. That's part of what we want to do as a practice, is equip the church on how to talk about these things. Why should we talk about these things? You gonna say something?
No, I was just thinking in my head of it's both sides. I was sexually abused as a kid, and I didn't tell anybody till I was 19. Mm-hmm. It's just something I compartmentalized it and just moved on. But now that I've really looked at stuff, it definitely impacted a lot of stuff in my childhood as well. So you really,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's on the flip side of what you were saying, but I think that's the importance of facilitating that healthy environment to talk to your kids and encourage them, like, hey, look, you can trust us. We want to talk to you. Yeah, we still have rules. These are the household rules, but we are here for you, and have that nurturing environment for whatever situation may present itself. Because I never felt comfortable. I never felt like it was something that I was going to talk about, and then I just put it away in a box and never dealt with it. But then it dealt with me more than I ever realized.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, definitely. I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like we said, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys. So that's the thing. If you're in a room full of 100 people,
Yeah.
100 women, you got 70% of them in the room. That's pretty insane, and so you're not alone in that. I've had my own trauma and, during puberty and all those kind of things with cousins and neighbors, and it's so common for us to have been abused or been neglected or been, emotionally, physically touched or had play, and it'd been, oh, I don't know what this is. This is crazy. This is stimulating. This is overwhelming. Right. And then you shove that, and then you're like, I'm never telling anybody that ever again. Because the idea that you would share that with somebody and they wouldn't just say, get out of here, I don't love you, right? Or you're dirty, or you're broken, or it was your fault, or now I got to go deal with the person who did it. And bring that all back up and cause a problem in their life and report it and all these things. There's so many reasons, and so I think that's why it's so important for people to get trained on how to talk to your kids about these things, because you reduce that by like 90%, right?
I think also understanding the cultural messages, like not just the family messages, but the cultural messages around it as well, because so many of my partners, probably just women in general, I won't even say partners, just women that I work with in general that have had some sort of sexual abuse. One, they may not even call it that,
right,
because it's just, they were just being a guy. I'm like, no. So they may not even call it that. But then I've had some tell me that, well, I was drunk, and so it was bound to happen.
Yeah, I shouldn't have been drunk.
I shouldn't have been drunk. Well, I was wearing this, right? So it's these cultural messages that maybe they didn't pick up in family, but just places outside of there that impact how they view what's happened to them. That it's their fault that someone else did something to them that was boundary violating, harmful, hurtful, and abusive. That they've made. That's where the shame comes in too. Is there's also not that education on boundaries of, okay, well, you could be, I use this with especially my women clients all the time. I'm like, you could be standing nude in an alleyway and no one has a right to do anything to you.
Right.
What you and I need to talk about is why you were standing nude in an alleyway.
Right.
Right. And why you were there.
Well, I think that's that's so beautifully said, because that's what the world's not wanting to talk about. It's so bipartisan and so broken off. It's like, it's one or the other. And it's like, no, it's both. Like, we have to have both of those conversations.
Right.
We have to have, hey, why are you watching porn? Let's handle that. Why aren't y'all having sex? Both of those conversations have to happen without shaming either partner. But there's a healthy relationship, and then there's unhealthy, and we have to name that sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not blaming people for the other person's actions. It's saying, why were you standing naked in the alley? Yeah.
Right.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That moves into, we won't get into all of it, but like the Me Too movement and all those kind of things. Like, there's so much rich, good stuff about that. And then there's so many things that are like, well, that's taking it too far, or taking it over here, or inconsistent. But if you try to talk about the inconsistency, then you're saying none of the other good stuff matters. You know, it's like, you have to be able to talk about it in nuance, though.
And it's hard to find a middle ground.
Yeah, it is. I think that's, why more people need training, more people need equipping. People need to be able to understand the science behind it, the family systems aspect of it. I mean, it's really rich. I mean, look at all the stuff we've talked about in an hour and a half. For people to be able to, like, we're just spouting it out, but like, if you don't know any of this, but you're dealing with all of it, it's really scary and overwhelming. Right.
And just to point out, it's an investment. You have to invest the time into it. And I think, I know this sounds like I'm talking bad about culture, but just the way that the world is right now, we want, faster, stronger, better, quicker, like cheaper. But all of it. And, I want to scroll and my computer to be faster, like all of it. And so we get used to that, and we just want, what's the quick answer? Am I a porn addict? Like, what do I do? What are the steps? And it's just so much work in that. And it's not simple,
It's not. All right, if you are struggling with this stuff, or maybe you're a spouse whose husband or wife's watching porn, or has cheated, or you caught them doing something, what are kind of what's the treatment plan? What do we normally do? What's a typical way we walk people through this? What can they expect to deal with? Because there is no one set thing, but there's kind of a general foundation.
Yeah, my sarcastic brain was thinking, run away.
Yeah.
No.
Don't do that. Absolutely not.
No.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, just making that first step to reach out and start the process. Don't get, I know we mentioned, maybe 2 to 3 years earlier. Don't let that discourage you, because it's not about that. It's about, you taking that first step, and every day you're going to have to continue to take a first step. Not referencing the 12 steps. I'm just saying you will have to take a step every day. And it's not about you necessarily. The goal is to get to the top of the mountain, but you need to look at the 2 steps or 3 steps right in front of you, or you stay where you're at, but do you want to stay where you're at for 10 years and not do any work on yourself?
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. has a quote that I use pretty often with clients first starting of, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step.
Right.
And I think that's same idea. Of you don't have to see the whole path in front of you. Don't let that 2 to 3 years freak you out just to step in and take the first step.
Right. And the whole 2 to 3 years isn't as hard as the first. It's like, yes, it's a 2 to 3 year process, but like the second year and the third year, you're coming to therapy and working through things, and it can be really rich and good and hard, but like good for you. Where the first year, it feels like a lot of times, like it's just that first 6 months, that first year is just super painful, and it's a lot of recovery.
Right.
But once you get the recovery under your belt, then you start to be able to do the bigger picture stuff.
And it's not like every session is rough, right? I've seen the light bulb come on and the aha moments, and it really, like, after that point, there's a shifting of just how you view what's going on, how you view yourself, like really sorting through some stuff, so it's not, just a horrible first year. There's going to be tough moments. There's going to be good moments that you're going to be enlightened. You're going to have weeks where, it's just really difficult. And so, having the support aspect and having, outside support, whether it be a 12-step group or whatever other kind of support system you come up with, and therapy, like it's going to be, worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I say to my clients, the opposite of addiction is connection. And so just finding that, like you're saying, in a 12-step group, even just coming to see a therapist, that's just the first big part in treating this and seeking help for this, is finding a way to connect to somebody in some way. That's shame reducing in itself, I think.
Well, that sounds terrible. So why would I do that?
Right. Right. And that's the other thing is it is terrible, right? It does feel terrible. And the reason to do that is I think even, and I mean, maybe y'all correct me, but I think even in that first session, once a person can make it through that first terrible session, they may feel some sort of hope they haven't experienced before if they're with somebody that knows what they're doing and what the path could look like for them. I think even just getting that first hour over with can give some sort of hope to say, okay, this may be a long process and I understand why I'm doing this terrible journey now.
Yeah. It reminds me Jesus and just being 100% graceful and 100% truthful at the same time. As a Christian counselor, we're able to say, listen, we love you and we accept you and we understand. And here's probably how you got here. And here's the pattern in which we've normally seen. And tell us your story and how you got to this point. We're not jumping in on, I can't believe you're watching porn. I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you did that. It's like, no, we totally can believe it. And let's just paint the picture of how you got here. Because you probably never looked at that. You focus so much on the behavior and how shameful and terrible you are for this behavior. You've never put in context why the behavior's happening. But then the other side is we also speak truth of like, yes, we love you, and yes, you're worthy, and yes, you're valuable, but you're saying these things are killing you, and we want to help you for them not to kill you because they're toxic. And so we're going to hold you accountable. We're going to do the exercises. We're going to make you do the work. And although it's painful, it has a purpose. If that makes sense.
Yeah. It's never about taking the easy road. And I think we've just, become accustomed to that of wanting the easy way out. I'm going to go get this diploma and go to school just to make it easy. But if you change your mindset and say, no, I want to learn, I want to, that's what this is about. It's not just, getting the diploma and moving on to the next part of life, because then you're not enjoying the moment. You're just focused on something down the road and you're not really in the present.
It's good.
It's all about perception.
No, it definitely is. One of the questions people ask me all the time is, I had a sex addiction group, Facing the Shadow group, at a church one time, and I did it for probably 4 or 5 weeks, maybe a 10-week one, and then we're going to start the next one. And the leadership came in and said, hey, listen, we have youth on Wednesday night. It's on another side of the church, but the parents saw the sign or heard that this was happening, and they feel like their kids are in danger. And so can we talk, like, for the people that are out there, how does pedophilia, which is the attraction to kids or child pornography, how does that play into addiction? What's the overlap there? Should people be terrified, like, if my husband watches porn, he's going to end up abusing our children?
I love this topic. Isn't that weird?
Not for me.
No, it's not weird.
Yeah. Did you have a thought?
I'm thinking. You go first.
Yeah. So this is something, especially whenever I was working primarily with sex addicts, that I've faced often. Because the other word that gets thrown around is not just pedophile, but pervert. And you maybe had that in your questions. I can't remember. But those are the two words that get thrown around pretty often. And another reason why someone doesn't want to label themselves as a sex addict, because then people are going to think that they're a pedophile or a pervert. And so I think you had something in there about child pornography too.
Yeah.
No, just because someone is a sex addict does not mean that they are a pedophile. And just because they are a pedophile does not mean that they are a sex addict, right? And so it's the same for like a sexual offender. Just because someone is a sexual offender doesn't mean that they're a sex addict. Just because they're a sex addict doesn't mean they're a sexual offender. I have seen where it's that overlap, where it's both. I have worked with individuals that have been diagnosed with pedophilia, and majority of those that I've worked with have felt such extreme shame over it. Pretty dark places that they've got, like suicidal thinking, attempted suicide. So most of them with that have a lot of shame around it. Those that I've worked with, majority of them that have struggled with that have had the childhood trauma that have created an arousal template that's really, really harmful. And that's where it's hard to hate people from up close. Because like the people that you're talking about, I mean, I don't know this church, so not to knock on them or anything, but just using that as an example of that's a lack of education for the public around what sex addiction is and what a sex addict is, is to think that these people are extremely harmful to other people. The reality is sex addicts are generally really high-functioning individuals, and most people in the public aren't going to know that the people they're interacting with are a sex addict.
Right. Go ahead.
No, I was saying they're your doctors, they're your lawyers, they're your pastors, they're and they're not out just perpetrating against everyone.
Right.
I mean, and it's, you can never talk in absolutes because you're never sure, right? You can't promise anything. But most people that are going to go, let's say, to a Facing the Shadow group at a church, they're at the point where like, hey, I need help. I have this extreme shame, and I want to change this. I'm not trying to come here to think
Act
about
out.
any kids, anything. I'm not acting out. I really just want to have some support because I need this in my life. And then if you think of, while I'm not an expert on predators, but I mean, if you think of what a predator would be, it's somebody that goes into a congregation and they talk the talk, they do everything right, and they are probably some of the most respectful people in the congregation, and they play that role very well, because it's just pathological at that point. And so those could be more of, what would a predator look like, so there's not, I mean, and there's not like a typical sort of, I guess, MO, it just really depends.
I think the stats show that most people who deal with arousal towards children, 99% of them, I'd probably say 100, have sexual trauma, have sexual neglect, have been as a child sexually abused intensely. Like not just a little, no abuse is good, but multiple times over years, never dealt with it. Then they watch pornography, right? That might start with adult functioning, but because of how pornography is, you need the higher arousal. Then they get triggered by their past. They see something that they weren't looking for, and now that's arousing. So can you, Brent, will you talk a little bit about like what an arousal template is and how that forms? Because I think people have a really hard time. Well, I don't think anybody knows that. And I think we're going to see this be a conversation that needs to be had in the next 5 years because it's, blowing up.
Right. I mean, an arousal template is basically just what arouses you based off of, your different experiences, whether it be, if you have trauma in the past or, just a lot of preference, so if, I talk a lot about with, pornography, right? Like the types of pornography people watch, what really gets you going, in comparison to maybe something else that isn't necessarily as arousing. So, I mean, it's not this complex term that's super confusing. I mean, it is what it sounds. It's, what arouses you. But you get much more in depth when you start working with people to really figure out, what about, this type of pornography or this behavior, what is that? Like, what are the reasons, what drives you? Like, what makes this different than, let's say, this other type of pornography? I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different variables to look at. And I mean, I see a lot of people often minimize like, oh, well, I just like, girl on girl porn or something, like, oh, no big deal, but okay, so it's, well, what's underneath that? Like, where does that come from? And so when you really start to dig under, then you start to really see, maybe different types of childhood trauma, or your dad flopping a magazine of Two Girls Down whenever you were 13 and you found it in there on the nightstand or something.
Right. It was like the first thing you saw, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's just so many different variables. I hope that that was what you're looking for.
No, it was good. Yeah. Olivia? Any more to say to that?
Arousal template.
Just for people to understand, I guess that is what I'm looking for. I guess I just want people to understand that what turns men and women on, whether a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing, isn't coming out of nowhere.
Right.
Right. That people have varying degrees of arousal because of their family system, because of their exposure, and because of their lack of education around these issues. And so I think a lot of people struggle with being aroused by certain things and thinking, well, I'm unique and I'm gross, or I like this and my wife doesn't have it, or my husband doesn't have it, and so I need to go seek it over here because it's the only thing that's going to do it for me. And what people have to understand is they have to go back into why is that the case, and actually they can deal with that. They can find ways that thing is either healthy or you steer it in a healthy direction, But once you actually understand the emotional component and where it started, then the thing isn't that big of a deal. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think y'all said it really well.
Okay.
The only thing I'd add is I see a lot of the time people don't marry their arousal template.
Right. Like literally.
Very, very true.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah, like they don't. I've seen that pretty often where they aren't married to their arousal template.
Yeah, my wife and I laugh about it all the time because she is blonde-headed and blue-eyed, and everybody in our family is, dark complexion, dark hair. And so when I was growing up, I would always just be like, in my head, I'm like, I'm going to marry a dark complected person. That's who I'm attracted to. Really tan, really dark. That's the thing. And you go through these, and I didn't really ever connect the dots. That's just in my head as a teenager. Like, oh, well, you have this kind of thing that you visualize. One, because I didn't want it to make my family feel weird. I remember that difficulty in the beginning of her coming over and being the only blonde-headed, blue-eyed person in the group. And there's part of you that's like, if you're insecurely attached and you have trauma, you're like, well, I don't want to stir anything up. So let me just go find something that's simple. And so that arousal, right? It doesn't have to be overtly sexual. It can be very emotional in your family system of like what makes them feel comfortable and what is normal and what are they going to like. It's like, it's the whole like city boy, coming into the country town and everybody's like, who's this city guy, or vice versa. Those are part of what makes up why you're attracted to people. And if you don't deal with it, then yeah, you marry people for the wrong reasons and then you have to deal with that later. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just want people, that's what I wanted people to understand, is that it's deeper than just, oh, I'm attracted to this person just because it happened. That's not actually how it works.
Right. Just to tag on what you just said, I mean, I want to point out, like, you can deal with it later, because I think a lot of times people often just, give up and then they retreat into this fantasy world, with pornography or whatever. But there is an ability to deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're attracted to something that goes against your morals or goes against who you think God's made you to be, there is a way to figure out if that was something that was originally given to you or if that was a part of your family trauma and system. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody's struggling out there right now or has a situation that they're struggling with, that they're like, this goes against who I am, who people, my family says that I am, who my morals say that I am, it's making me uncomfortable. Like, let's ask some questions and dive into what's happened to you and how that formed and how that started and when it started, because there's some basic biology, before puberty that says kids aren't looking at each other as sexual creatures. There's attachment and attunement, but, not many 5-year-olds are looking at each other and thinking, I want to have sex with you, or I want to be sexual towards you. If they are, then most likely they've been exposed to something, something's happened to them, their testosterone or estrogen levels are off. There's something going on that has made them a very small statistical number that has that problem or that struggle going on.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't get addressed, and then that over the course of puberty balloons into all kinds of other problems. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would just say that goes into the shame piece. Like, because with it being those young ages, a lot of kids explore, like boys start to realize, oh, she doesn't have this part. Well, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. Right. So they start to explore each other's bodies. My mom was a pre-K teacher for a year and had to like monitor the hallway bathrooms because kids just started getting interested and curious. And so that goes back to that conversation of how are you talking to your kids? Is it a shameful conversation? Generally, it's the parent shame around sex that gets transmitted down to the kids whenever it's that kind of situation. So anyway, not to get too distracted. But
no, that's great.
Just a thought.
No, you can keep going with that. I mean, I think that's spot on. I think, parents need to deal with their own stuff so they're not projecting and passing that inappropriate stuff onto their kid and saying, oh, well, this is just that, or they're just this way, or they've always been this way, and not taking into consideration what they've played into that. I think that's a huge issue I see with preteens and then teens, whatever they're dealing with sexually, coming and saying, well, here's what I've always felt. And the parents are like, yep, they've always been that way. But then when we get into it, it's like, well, we were divorced and they had some trauma and they saw porn one time and they did this. And it's like, but we're just going to pretend like none of that affected this current issue because the parent doesn't want to be blamed for it. Mm-hmm. And so then we're going to just give a general, like, this is just how it is. And like, for me, I find that people find a lot of, no hope in that. They're like, well, that means I can't change. That means I can't recover. That means I can't overcome this. This is just who I am. You know, I'm going to always struggle with this. And I think what we've seen clinically is that, no, people can rewire their brains and they can change the way they are aroused to things, and they can change the way that they, you know, struggle with sexual issues in their life. That doesn't mean it always goes away.
Right.
I mean, those things might still be there, but you feel less shame, you feel in control, and you know what you're dealing with, and you know where it comes from.
Right. I often say it takes persistence and consistency. You know, just, I mean, that you have to to be intentional about what you're doing. There's not an easy fix sometimes.
No, there's not. Okay, any final thoughts or comments or anything we missed that I didn't go over?
I always have final thoughts and comments.
That's fine.
Can I circle back to one thing really quickly that I thought about? I think I have ADD because I think at the same time that I listen to people talk. Going back to the church and Christianity and doing this work, the other thing that I would just add to that really quickly is so often I think the message gets passed on that, especially with men, if they have a problem with pornography, if they get married, I think you and I have talked about this, that if they get married, then now that will help heal their pornography problem.
Yeah, so to be specific, if you get married as a dude and you think, oh, well, we're going to be having sex more, so I'm not going to struggle with porn.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not necessarily true.
Yeah. That would just be the only thing that I would circle back to is there's hope in that too of if you're struggling with this and thinking, well, if only I could get married, then I wouldn't struggle with sexual sin anymore. You know, that's not necessarily the case. And I would really encourage anyone that struggles with that to seek help prior to getting married.
Yeah.
And if you are married and struggling with that, seek help with that as well. Because it's like you said earlier of, can't remember how you phrased it, but essentially looking at pornography as an affair behavior in the marriage. So anyway, I just got to thinking about that and thinking, you know, I would tag that on to what I was saying about Christianity and sex addiction work. Not saying, anyway, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Of not saying just because you watch porn, you're a sex addict, but that if you're struggling with that sexual sin, adding someone to that does not mean it goes away.
Right.
So anyway,
I've seen that before as well. You know, I mean, it's definitely a great point.
Yeah, I think it takes community, and I think one of the things to change the course of, I mean, I think this is an epidemic, right, that we have right now. This sexual trauma, sexual sin, sexual brokenness is a pandemic. It's a worldwide issue, and it's interesting because it crosses all socioeconomic statuses, right? It's not like there's not a lot of rich upper middle class people smoking crack, right? But there are a lot of rich upper or middle class people and really poor people watching porn, struggling with trafficking, being coerced, dealing with all these things, and so everybody's susceptible to it.
Yep.
And with the phone and with the internet and with everything else, like, you're susceptible to it at a larger level because you also now have so many generations of this primer of trauma and this primer of divorce and this primer of attachment and this primer of sexual neglect. It's like the kids are all primed and ready for this now huge dopamine drip to just hit them, and then it goes off to the races. And so the church has to see that and go, we have to equip ourselves. We have to have people come in that are professionals and train us and talk to us so we can equip the parents. Because if we know what the stats are, which people don't, I was talking to somebody yesterday and their kid's struggling, and they were saying, I was telling them about the self-harm rate has increased 200% in 10 years, and the suicide rate in teens has increased 76%. And they both of them are like crying, and I'm like, the fact that you don't know that, like, that's the problem, right? It's like, how can the stat be this large and yet the average person doesn't know that 76% of teens are killing themselves more, right? That 200% more kids are cutting themselves. How is that not a known fact? And it's because we don't talk about it. Same with sex, same with porn. The church kind of shies away from it. We don't really want to deal with it. So then you have a Bible study full of men, full of women, and you're with them for a year. You know what the stats are, and yet no one's talking about it. And for me, it's like, what's the point? If we're not going to contextualize this brokenness and reduce shame, all we're doing is keeping people isolated, and eventually they're just going to not come. They're not going to come to the church. They're not going to show up to the Bible study. They're going to go, I have this thing that's killing me that I'm depressed and anxious about. I come expecting to be able to share it, or desiring to share it, really. If somebody would just push me or ask me a question or open the door, say, me too. and yet people don't do that because, like you said, it's like our parents. We're all still not dealing with our stuff, so we don't feel comfortable talking about it in a group. I think as disciple makers, as leaders in the church, we have to be able to boast in our weaknesses, right? We have to be able to believe that people can be transformed by the renewing of their mind so that they have hope. And we can be really confident as clinicians to do that. But man, how much better would it be if the body was doing that? Mm-hmm. So I just encourage you, if you're listening and you're in a church, if you're a Christian, if you're, you're struggling with this, or your kids are struggling with it, reach out for help. Ask professionals. Call Brent or Olivia or me or our practice and, CSAT in your area, and find someone who's trained, who understands the nuances of this stuff, who can meet with you and walk with you, because there is hope and you can recover. And I don't know about y'all, but I see people stay married and then they have 1,000 times better marriage than they've ever thought they could have. Have y'all seen that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see people come back and go, man, like our marriage is so much better than it ever was. Mm-hmm. I don't want to trade it for what we have.
I'll have people walk in, and I have a couple right now that got a bit frustrated with me because the husband came in. He was like, I came in with a porn problem and now I have a marriage problem.
Right.
Yeah. I was like, so you didn't before? Porn was...
Right. You just caused it.
Right. So, yeah, absolutely, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, any closing thoughts, comments?
I feel like we hit a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we did cover some stuff. Mm-hmm. That's good stuff. I really appreciate you guys. I know that I love talking about CSAT stuff with CSAT, so it makes me not feel as crazy. Yeah. I think sometimes we can get kind of stuck in the funnel, and it's good to see other people doing good work and realizing there are other people fighting this. I know.
Yeah, it's tough being the only person down there in Lake Charles.
Well, I know it is. Yeah,
just not having the ability to work with other CSATs is tough just in and of itself.
Oh yeah, it makes the job very complicated.
Oh, it does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you're listening, Brent Woods, he's Woods Counseling. He's in. You can look him up on Facebook, Instagram. What's your website?
WoodsCounselingServices.com.
Yeah, and he's in Lake Charles. So if you need a referral down there, or you got people anywhere close to there and need some help, he's a great counselor, good therapist, good Christian dude, good dad. I like him a lot, so call him up. And then Olivia Mason, she's over in Ruston, in our Ruston office at Clint Davis Counseling. You can find her on our website. Give us a call. If you need help, reach out. I'd suggest checking out the rest of our podcasts that we've done on this topic. And if you heard something in this episode that we didn't dive deep enough into, it's probably because we did a whole podcast on that one thing. So whether it's family systems or talking to your kids about sex or trauma or betrayal trauma, we have whole episodes on all of that stuff to really deep dive into. So we hope this was helpful. We wish you all the best. Yeah, man. Thank you. God bless you and have a good day.